Hey everybody, welcome to the Evanston History Center. I'm Chris Hartzell. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm Chris Hartzell, Director of Facilities and Visitor Services and Collections, and I also curated the Marshall Fields exhibit tonight. And that was a great joy to do. I really had a lot of fun doing it. In fact, I was saying that the round table was out earlier today to take some pictures, and he said, why did you do this exhibit? And I thought, well, the answer to that is because it makes everybody happy. It was so much fun. Maybe those of us of a certain age, but everybody has memories. I have memories. I grew up in Evanston. I remember shopping there, and I was going to say, I've heard so many stories in putting this exhibit together, and not only personal memories, but not everybody, but a lot of people had friends or family that worked for Marshall Fields. So raise your hand if you knew somebody that worked for Fields. Oh my, look at that! Isn't that ridiculous? I love it. That's crazy. It's. Oh, Kristen wants to get a picture of that. Yeah, there you go. I love that. Well, that explains the enthusiasm. It had such a place in our hearts, didn't it? Before I introduce Leslie, I would like to say before we begin, please silence or turn off your cell phones. And I know there's going to be somebody who forgets, and it might be me. But yeah, that's always nice to do. So I am pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Leslie Goddard. Some of you may remember Leslie Goddard was curator here many years ago. Yeah, okay, there you go. So she's kind of coming home, and we're so glad to have her back for this talk. Thank you, Leslie. Really appreciate it. She is the author of the book, Remembering Marshall Fields, which I have my own copy, thank you very much, and has been lecturing on Marshall Fields and other history topics for more than 15 years. Trained as a historian, she holds a PhD from Northwestern University and a master's degree in museum studies. She is a lifelong Chicago resident whose family has more than 50 years' experience working for Marshall Field and Company. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Leslie Goddard.
Chris, thank you. Thanks. Oh, wait. I have to mention, I have my Marshall Fields mug with me, and I have my Marshall Fields bracelet on, and I even managed to find a green cardigan, so I was pleased. I will give you, hang on. I will give you my street cred as I start. I worked for 1 year for the Oak Brook Center, Marshall Fields. My real connection to Fields is through my grandfather, and I found the silver plate that he got after 25 years. Do you remember when companies gave silver plates for milestones like that? Oopsie, let me put this down. We mentioned how many people here worked at Fields or knew someone who worked at Fields. Did anyone in this room ever shop at a Marshall Fields store? Raise your hand. You'd be hard-pressed to find many people in the Chicago area who didn't at least once shop there. When you hear the phrase Marshall Fields, whether you're thinking about the Evanston store or the State Street store or any of the others, what are the images or the ideas that immediately come to your mind? Toss them out. The Christmas trees, the Christmas windows, the walnut room, the clock, the wedding gifts, Frango mints, the delivery truck, Santa Claus. Do you remember the other Christmas mascot at Marshall Fields? Uncle Mistletoe and Freddie Field Mouse. Anyone remember any of the other food specialties besides Frango mints? The Field Special, you got it. The Field Special was this open-faced sandwich that I even should have a photograph of. Most people tend to have very similar recollections when I ask that. People think about, wait, I have it. I'm getting the green. And it's not giving me the click. Can you just double check if the little doohickey? There's a technical word for it, right? If you never had one, a Fields special sandwich was an open-faced sandwich with chicken and bacon and Swiss cheese, turkey, yes, and a half a head of iceberg lettuce covered in Thousand Island dressing. The staff used to call it the brain because it looked like sort of a gloppy half globe. I think it's fascinating that so many of us have so many of the same memories of Marshall Fields, and they're really strong. In fact, this is the cover of my book, which when I was working with the editor about what image we're going to have, I said, I want something that was really iconic, like one of those clocks. Do we get it working? I have another clicker if we need one. We've got the spare clickers. That's okay, not at all. Fun trivia for you. One of my favorite stories. There are actually two clocks, one at State in Washington and one at State in Randolph. Woman told me a story of how she and her husband got engaged. And he said, I didn't buy a ring because I want both of us to go to Marshall Fields and choose your ring together. So let's meet on Friday at noon under the clock at Marshall Fields. So Friday at noon, one of them went to State in Washington, one of them went to State in Randolph. They almost had this horrible moment, but she figured it out, and they were married for 50 years at the time I talked to them. So the ideas and images like the great clock at Marshall Fields, like Frango Min's, this is just to make you hungry, the great tree in the Walnut Room, and the great Christmas window displays, the Tiffany mosaic in the South Rotunda, which has been an icon of that store since 1907. There's the Fields special. When they took this off the menu, so many people kept ordering it that they will still make it to this day. Sometimes it's even on the menu. I'm going to open by putting out there that these memories we have are so strong. It's testimony to what a special place Marshall Fields has in the hearts of so many Chicagoans. For many years, the store on State Street was a cornerstone around which a lot of downtown activities happened. But I want to start near the end. I want to start in 2005. That was the year that the new owners of Marshall Field and Company, a company called Federated Department Stores, announced that in 1 year's time, they would rename and rebrand all Marshall Field stores as Macy's. In Chicago, this brought out a deep gut-level reaction. Protesters came out in September 2005 with banners. This is an image from 2007, but you might be able to see some of the signs say, Fields is Chicago, boycott Macy's, and give the lady what she wants. That's the name of the 1952 anniversary book. But here's the thing. They came out in 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, and they have announced they will be out protesting, probably on Black Friday of 2024. Even among other great American department stores, this is unusual. The BBC sent reporters to Chicago once to find out what is it about Chicagoans that they feel so strongly about this store. And then I find a really interesting question, because this store did some things that really inspired phenomenal loyalty. So let's go back. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. Marshall Fields usually dated its beginnings to 1852. That was the year the founder of this great enterprise arrived in Chicago. And the founder, of course, was Potter Palmer. If you were going to say Marshall Field, you would not be alone. This is one of the very few great department stores not founded by the person whose name it had most of its history. You might know Potter Palmer better for something like the Palmer House Hotel or the Gold Coast or just State Street in general. He was a New York Quaker, came to Chicago in 1852, In 1852, Chicago was still a frontier town, mostly wooden buildings. The population in the 1850 census was somewhere around 30,000 residents. But Potter Palmer felt this city had energy and already the best transportation nexus in the country with the railroad. So he decided to open his dry goods store. He was planning on going into dry goods, but he decided not to go west. He was thinking about California maybe. He decided to open his dry goods store in Chicago on the first great commercial thoroughfare of Chicago, which was, of course, Lake Street. Believe it or not. Before State Street was the commercial center, it was Lake Street, and it kind of makes sense because Lake Street is very close to the river. And at the time when river transportation was primary, it was very convenient. So we're looking here at Lake Street in the 1860s. P. Palmer Dry Goods is the tallest building on that street. He introduced some key innovations, not necessarily new of all time, but certainly new in Chicago. First of all, there was a real emphasis on attracting women, beautiful displays, merchandise that wasn't just good woolens and sturdy calicos, but laces and luxury velvets. Then he announced there would be no haggling over prices in his store. Most 19th century stores still operated on haggling. He was one price and it's on the merchandise. And it was wildly successful. In the 1860s, he introduced what a lot of people thought was his most advanced idea, which was that any merchandise that you purchased in his store could be return, no questions asked. The majority of stores only took back things if they arrived damaged or not what you ordered. He would take back anything. You know, you get home and you don't like the color, just bring it back. He's really transforming what is a chore, something you gotta do, into this pleasant leisure time activity. However, he turned to two partners in the 1860s, and they were the two guys that you see here. This is Marshall Field on the left and Levi Leiter on the right. The reason he brought these two in as partners is that Potter Palmer's health was in decline, and his doctors told him he should go to Europe and get his health back. So he brought in these two. Marshall Field was from Massachusetts, very hustling store clerk. In the 4 years since he had arrived in Chicago in 1856, he had risen from clerk to junior partner to full partner in this other firm. Levi Leiter was a financial whiz, just brilliant at credit and financial oversight. So Levi Leiter and Marshall Field team up, join Potter Palmer for a couple of years, and eventually buy him out. So in 1868, the firm's name was changed to Field, Leiter and Company. This is one of the trade cards that they gave out. This was when lithography was really new and people would collect these images. I have no idea what a little boy carrying water has to do with Levi Leiter or Field, Leiter and Company, but they were beautiful images to collect. But if you have good eyesight, you might notice something interesting about the back of this card. Underneath, retail, dry goods, it says State and Washington Streets. That is because in 1868, they moved their business to State and Washington to this building. What we're looking at here is State Street, that's the street you see in the lower left, and Washington over here. This is a building that was put up by Potter Palmer when he got back to Chicago. This is how outrageous Potter Palmer was. He just decided Lake Street has no future. You can't expand it east or west, and certainly you can't go too far north, and it's kind of smelly. He decided to shift the retail and commercial axis of Chicago from Lake Street to State Street. So he bought up as much merchandise buildings as he could on State Street, tore down a lot of old ones, put up beautiful new ones. At one end of his stretch, he put up this beautiful hotel called the Palmer House. And at the northern end, he put up the building that you see here. This is a gorgeous marble-fronted building, very European architecture. When they opened on the first day, they handed out cigars to every man and roses to every woman. But it turns out 1868 is not a great year to be putting up a major building in Chicago. What's coming? The Great Chicago Fire. On the morning after the fire in 1871, this is what the corner of State and Washington looked like. The fire burned up more than $2 million worth of goods and destroyed the building. They actually worked frantically to save it. They were putting wet blankets out the window and rushing merchandise out. But here's the interesting thing. Within 10 days, Field, Leiter and Company had resumed operations. They found a streetcar barn and transformed it. And within 2 years, they were back at the corner of State and Washington. It's kind of setting this precedent that nothing is impossible for Field, Leiter and Company. And it's part of this reputation this store gets for being able to accomplish the impossible. This building is larger than the earlier one, and it's now only retail. The earlier stores had all been both wholesale and retail in one building. Now, this building is all retail. They moved wholesale to another building closer to the railroad stations. Wholesale is where they were purchasing goods and then reselling them to mom and pop stores all across the Midwest. This building opened to great triumph and stood for only 5 years. In 1877, this one burned to the ground. Again, they found temporary quarters. This time it was just a faulty, not just, but it was a faulty chimney flue. Didn't burn down the city, thank goodness. Again, they rebuilt or they moved back into a new building at State and Washington. So the building you see here opened in 1879. I think this might be the most beautiful building they ever occupied. Not only is it lavish in the exterior ornamentation, it's got this beautiful French mansard roof. Inside were light wells because it was lit by gas, so they wanted to flood the building with natural light. I don't know if you can see, but down at the bottom, there are horse-drawn buses. They would take people from the railroad stations to the store and back, as easy as you can imagine. 2 years after they moved into this building, Levi Leiter either decided it was time to retire, or Marshall Field and his cronies got together and basically kicked him out. So it was 1881 that the business reorganizes as Marshall Field and Company, the name it will have in perpetuity, or until 2006, because perpetuity is not what it used to be, right? What Marshall Field did very, very well was to continue the policies of Potter Palmer, remarkable returns policy, flair for high quality merchandise. He often stood inside the door wearing white gloves to greet everyone. He trained the doormen to know their customers by name and greet them personally. There's a very famous story that one day he was walking through the store and he saw one of his buyers, a manager, arguing with a customer. So he went over and he said, "What's the problem here?" And the manager said, "It's nothing. I'm just settling a complaint." And Marshall Field said, "No, you're not. Give the lady what she wants." And that became the store's slogan and then the title of that book in 1952. When you think about it, not every store at the time put the customer's needs ahead of its own profits. What the store was really saying was, we value what you want ahead of our own needs. And they took that seriously. Marshall Field always said, don't hesitate if someone's bringing something back. We don't want to worry too much about the pennies and forget about the dollars behind them. In other words, if someone's returning something and clearly they've used it, it's okay because we want to keep them as customers for a long time. Now, this is an easy policy to abuse, but in those days, people were more less likely to abuse it, although there were abuses for sure. A funny story, there was one time when the buyer for the lace department bought an $800 lace tablecloth. In the late 19th century, $800 is a lot of money. And Marshall Field said to him, "We are never going to sell an $800 tablecloth." Well, a couple weeks later or sometime later, Marshall Field came back and he told the lace buyer, he said, "I have to apologize. I was at Mrs. So-and-so's house last night and that lace tablecloth was on her dining room table." And the lace buyer said, no, I need to apologize. She returned it this morning." So even then, some people took advantage. But I think one of the things, above and beyond all of this, one of the things Marshall Field really did well was to recognize and promote talented staff. In 1887, he appointed this guy to head retail. And anyone know who he is? You got it. This is Harry Gordon Selfridge. If anyone watched the WTTW show, the PBS show, Mr. Selfridge, with Evanston's own Jeremy Piven, right? Harry Gordon Selfridge got his start at Marshall Field and Company. He started as a stock boy in the wholesale department, was booming with ideas and energy. So he became head of retail operations, and he really took the company into the modern department store era. When Potter Palmer started the business, it was dry goods, meaning mostly fabrics for clothing making and rugs and shawls. He started adding in books and shoes and bric-a-brac and furniture. When Harry Gordon Selfridge started, the company had 42 departments, always called sections. By the time he left, there were more than 100. He also greatly increased the ad budget. He expanded delivery. In 1885, he took the basement and turned it into a massive center for bargains and sales, eventually known as the budget floor. Fun cocktail party trivia for you. Filene's basement in Boston opened in 1909. Marshall Field's budget floor opened in 1885. It predated a lot of those. He also added in services. This is the main floor in the 1890s. It is still full service. If you would like to see one of these beautiful handkerchiefs, you have to ask one of these young men because all the stock is behind the counters. But what I'm interested in is what's going on the left. This sign, which you really can't read, says Kid Glove Cleaning Department. Selfridge started adding in all of these services. You could get pictures framed, you could get custom jewelry designed, you could have antique guns repaired, photographs developed. All these things that are not about direct retail merchandise sales, but they're giving customers another reason to come in the store. He also, I mentioned expanded delivery. This is one of my favorite photographs. This is taken in 1897. This is Holden Court. I don't know if you remember, there used to be that alley that ran between the two buildings. At the time of this photograph, Marshall Field had 400 delivery wagons and about 700 horses to cover their entire delivery service. I have no idea how they lined up these wagons as beautifully as they did. But it was true. They offered delivery, and it was often same-day delivery if you lived within easy access. But they would deliver as far north as Waukegan, which was way out in the boonies in the 1890s, as far south as Gary, Indiana, and as far west as Elgin, Illinois. Who's going to Elgin in those days, right? Well, if you're making clocks, you definitely were. It was also Selfridge who encouraged Marshall Field to start expanding. This is another photograph. This is actually it's the same one, right? That from 1879. It's actually a photograph taken in the 1890s. And the reason we know that is because this building up here, this is at the corner of, correct me if I'm wrong, Washington and Wabash, right? That building was the first addition, and it went up in 1893. Anyone remember what was happening in Chicago in 1893? The World's Fair, right? The World's Columbian Exposition. Selfridge wanted the store to be as big an attraction as the fair itself. So they put up this massive building, supposedly Spanish Renaissance architecture as a nod to Spain because it was honoring Columbus's voyage. Beautiful hand-carved mahogany counters and steam-powered elevators and beautiful lavatories. The bottom floors were retail space. The upper floors, they did contract work. So if you opened a hotel and you wanted it to be furnished, you could go to Marshall Fields and they could do the whole thing for you. But even that wasn't big enough. Chicago was growing so fast and so big that after the fair, Marshall Field started buying up property on State Street north of that 1879 building because he wanted an expansion. This is a great postcard from 1902. What we're seeing in the middle here, that's the 1879 building. This is State Street and Washington. Here's the 1893 expansion. This building opened in 1902 at State and Randolph Streets. This was a massive new building. It's about 13 stories tall with 3 sub-basements, very modern architecture. One person said, it's like a wall of windows. There were so many windows to it. The plan was to open this building and then tear down the 1879 building and put up a matching partner. And if you've been to State Street, you know that's exactly what they did. However, before they could do that, Marshall Field passed away. He died of pneumonia, very sadly. He went out to play golf on New Year's Day out in Wheaton. They were using red golf balls. And very sadly, he contracted pneumonia and passed away. Marshall Field was 71 years old at the time. He wasn't really expected to be gone. This can be a crisis moment for some businesses, the passing of your great visionary. But Marshall Field had the perfect successor already in place. It was not, sadly, his son. His son passed away, and that's a whole other story. It wasn't Harry Gordon Selfridge. He had left in 1904 and eventually went to London and started his own store. Anyone know the next president of Marshall Field and Company? I'm willing to bet, if you know Chicago, you know his name. The next one, John G. Shedd. John G. Shedd, who you might know for the Shedd Aquarium, got his start at Marshall Field and Company, also as a stock boy in the wholesale department in 1872. He was a brilliant salesman. He became head of wholesale eventually, when wholesale was the crown jewel of the company. He quadrupled the number of traveling salesmen, very judiciously oversaw the extension of credit, and wholesale just jumped. To give you an example, in the 1880s, when annual sales for Marshall Field and Company were around $30 million a year, 25 million of it came from wholesale, only about 5 million from retail. Wholesale was the crown jewel, and it was John Shedd who headed it up. So when Marshall Field passed away, John Shedd stepped in and things just continued on. In 1907, they completed the building project and opened the building that you see here. They had a week-long celebration. This store is really striking in multiple ways. Number one, its size. It's just a massive, full integrated architecture on State Street. It's also got these columns in the middle at what was intended to be the main entrance. Those columns and here's more cocktail party trivia for you, are said to be the second tallest granite columns in the world. They are about 49 feet 8 inches tall. If you would like to go to Egypt, to the Temple of Karnak, you can see taller granite columns. Otherwise, these are the biggest in granite. Also, extending along the front are these amazing display windows. There had been windows in the earlier stores, but windows were very necessary for bringing, light into earlier stores. Now, and here's an image where you can see those windows a little bit more clearly. Technology is now allowing for massive, uninterrupted expanses of glass. So you have these huge windows that are bigger than almost anyone had seen before. Although Marshall Field was very strict about character, so every Saturday night when the store closed, the window shades came down and they would stay down until the store opened again on Monday morning. Because, you don't want anyone window shopping on Sunday, right? The new store, though, was not just big. If we go back to this image, the store also had a lot of amazingly beautiful features. Do you notice anything missing in this image? The clocks, right? There should be a clock right here. They actually just had not put it up yet. The clocks, and the two of them, were not new to the store. The very first clock went up in 1897. This one, which was put up, it was actually designed by Pierce Anderson, the chief architect at Daniel Burnham and Company, who designed the building. So they're designed to go with the building. Each of the two clocks are made of 7 3/4 tons of cast bronze. That's why they have that beautiful green patina. The face of each clock is about 46 inches across. And my favorite bit of trivia, in Roman numerals, what's the number 4 usually indicated by? IV, right? On the Marshall Fields clocks, it's I. Not that unusual on Victorian clocks, and it helps you not mix it up with the 6, but kind of fun trivia to use. Part of the incentive for these clocks was to get people within the vicinity of the store. You'd say to your friend, just meet me under the clock at Marshall Fields. But of course, if you're in the vicinity of the store and you just need a new handkerchief, they don't mind at all. But what's interesting to me about it is that they very quickly became icons, not just of Marshall Fields, but of Chicago. I was checking out at my local Jewel. I live in the southwest suburbs now, and they had all these images of like Buckingham Fountain and the Chicago Theater, and there was one of the Marshall Fields clocks as a symbol of Chicago. Inside the store, probably the most striking thing was that Tiffany mosaic. The Tiffany mosaic, if you haven't seen it, it tops the South Rotunda. It is made of 1.6 million individual pieces of iridescent Favrile glass. And the firm that designed it was Louis Comfort Tiffany. The legend is after it was installed, they destroyed the plan, so it can never be duplicated. But here's what's interesting when you think about it. Obviously, they don't need the light wells anymore to bring natural light in. By this point, the store was lit by electricity. And it's a lot of floor space that's getting wasted that you could use for merchandise. But what the light well is doing, it's doing a couple of things. Number one, it's helping cool the store, right? Because hot air rises, so light wells help keep the store cool. But just as importantly, I think, it's helping to make this store a place where you're just surrounded by beauty. When you walk in the store, they've got the perfume counters right by the entrance, as they do to this day, right? Block out the smells of the street. When you walked in, they wanted to use light and color to kind of give you a sense that you're in this museum-like atmosphere. And the mosaic was a tremendous way to do it. Not to mention, it starts showing up in every tourist guidebook. If you're in Chicago, you gotta see the mosaic at Marshall Field and Company, and it brings people into the store. The store, by the way, I don't know if you know, but there are little windows up on the 5th floor. If you've never gone up there, it's worth it because you can get a close-up look at that mosaic, which see just how spectacular it is. Apparently, according to legend, it took 50 men 2 years to install that mosaic. But it wasn't just, going back to this image, it wasn't just the mosaic. On the bottom floor, the floor was laid in marble. The counters were beautifully round, cornered, carved mahogany. Someone said mahogany is like a cult in this store. They wanted to use the best materials. They wanted everything to reflect status and elegance. Outside the store, those windows started to become a major way that the store sort of built and maintained its reputation as the utmost in elegance. The window designer Arthur Fraser was brought in, and he just took the windows to a whole new level. He would use deep historical research to create these meticulously accurate settings and then put just a few gowns in them. This is, I believe, a display that was in the corner window at State and Washington. I mean, it's, 6, 7 dresses, but look at the size of this backdrop, and they've got this beautiful frieze here and all of this stencil and artwork. It was dazzling when the Marshall Field's windows opened. And customer service just kept increasing. Now, much of the 3rd floor was given over to service. This is the ladies' waiting room. There was also a gentleman's waiting room, which was tiny. They had a first aid room with a nurse there. For a while, they had what they called a silence room, which had little couches. So if you were overwhelmed with shopping, you could lie down and recover yourself. You could book a hotel room, you could buy theater tickets, you could leave a message for a friend, send a telegram, look up steamship or railroad schedules. They had phone books from about 100 different American cities and a whole wall of telephones. You might remember they had those for a long time. Elsewhere in the store, there was a beauty salon. You could get your hair done, get a manicure. Even for children, they had a children's barber shop. In other words, you could go to this store and spend the whole day, which a lot of shoppers did. And if you're going for the whole day, what are you going to need? Lunch. Well, you'll need money, but you'll also need food. The story of Marshall Field's first restaurant is shrouded in legend. Marshall Field's opened its very first tea room in 1890, and I believe this is what the tea room looked like in the 1890s. The legend is that in 1889, there was a saleswoman in the hat department. She had some hungry customers who were going to leave and go home for lunch. At this point, there were very few restaurants in downtown Chicago that would serve unescorted women. A lot of lunch places were saloons and grew out of bars and things like that. Women did not go there on their own in 1889. Apparently, this saleswoman said, wait a minute, I have this chicken pot pie for my lunch, my grandmother's recipe. Why don't you have that, and then you can keep shopping? And when Selfridge heard that, he almost immediately convinced Marshall Field to open up a little restaurant. And that just became bigger and bigger as the store kept expanding. And Mrs. Herring's chicken pot pie, you can still get it if you go to that building, right? This is the restaurant that opened in 1907 on top of the South Rotunda. It had this beautiful walnut paneling to it. So, of course, they called it the South Grill Room, which is a terrible, terrible name. It was customers who started referring to it as the restaurant with the walnut paneling, and that's what they eventually named it. By the way, if you think I'm making it up, here is a postcard showing you. They called it the South Grill Room. The thing about it, though, is that this was not the only restaurant. When the 1907 building opened, there were 7 restaurants on the 7th floor. There was the English Room, there was the Narcissus Room, there was the Wedgwood Room, things like that. Very quickly, these restaurants became almost like a club for especially the wives and daughters of Chicago's emerging middle and upper classes. But they still wanted to get men customers. The image I'm showing you here is the main floor of the store for men. The store for men opened in a separate building across the street. It's a 12-story building at the southwest corner, right, of Wabash and Washington. 12-story building. The store for men occupied the bottom 6 floors and the 3 sub-basements. Here's the interesting thing. This opens in 1914. In 1914, women were 90% of department store customers. Why have a separate store for men? There were a couple reasons. Department stores were seen as women's preserves, and the first floors usually had all kinds of impulse goods, handkerchiefs and purses and notions, thread. They always had thread on the first floor, so if you stop in and pick up a spool of thread, you might shop more. But they wanted to encourage men to see shopping as a leisure time activity the way women did, because men didn't shop at that time as a leisure time activity, but when they did shop, they tended to make big purchases. A man might buy, a year's worth of socks at a go, and they didn't tend to return as much as women did. So the company felt, like other stores did, that a separate store for men might encourage more men to shop the way women did. The store for men carried not only a full line of men's clothes and shoes and leather goods, but also a sportsman's floor. The sportsman floor was famous for this giant stuffed bear that apparently was a bear that had been hunted by a Chicago huntsman. This department carried everything you might need. I mean, there's skis and snowshoes and toboggans and golf clubs. There is a saddle in the middle here. Marshall Fields had custom saddle makers. They would measure your horse. They would go to your stable, measure your horse, and then measure you and create a custom saddle. I don't know how well you can see, but behind the bear, there is a full-size sailboat. So if you're out on your lunch break and you just need to pick up a sailboat, they've got you covered. For a while, they even had a little 2-seater air coupe airplane available for sale. I mean, really, you could buy anything from a spool of thread to an airplane. But by this point, the store for men opened 1914. By the late teens and into the 20s, the store had expanded, so it now occupied a full block. By the 1920s, it was the largest department store in the country in terms of number of sales. However, the 1920s was also the era when the automobile was causing more and more of Marshall Field's customers to move into the suburbs. So, the first branch of Marshall Fields opened in 1928. Anyone know what town it was in? Oh, all good guesses. It was actually Lake Forest. And I am sure it was a coincidence that there were members of the Field family living in Lake Forest. This is the Lake Forest store as it looked in the 1960s. It originally was a very small children's and infants wear store. Even after it moved into this building, though, it was always the smallest of all the Marshall Fields branches. The following year, though, in 1929, the company opened 2 new branches, including Evanston and a nearly identical one in Oak Park. And we say nearly identical because if you examine them closely, you'll see. And if you don't know the differences, you can check in the exhibit and find out the answer. The thing about these branch stores that I think is remarkable is that the architecture is really hearkening back to the downtown store. It kind of looks like columns a little bit. It's got that mansard roof at the top, hearkening back to the European style, but it's also very Art Deco, so it's telling you it's still modern and up to date, and it's got a clock on the corner. Not the same style, but enough to tell you this is Marshall Field and Company. And these branches did very well in the 20s and again in the 40s. The problem was, over time, as the shopping malls opened, people started doing their shopping at the shopping mall stores and made their returns at the smaller branch stores, and that's not good. There were multiple problems, but that was one of them. These suburban branches were really a start of expansion in retail. But the wholesale trade was going the other way. More and more mom and pop stores were buying directly from factories. More and more national chains are opening. Marshall Field and Company decided to save wholesale. They were going to open a new wholesale building, not just Marshall Field's wholesale, but a consolidated wholesale center for all of Chicago. What building am I thinking of? The Merchandise Mart. The Merchandise Mart was built by Marshall Field and Company. When they broke ground, it was still the height of the booming 1920s. By the time this building opened in 1930, the nation had entered the Great Depression. It did open as the world's largest building, but it did nothing to save wholesale. Marshall Field and Company posted a net loss of $8 million in 1932. That was the first loss it had ever posted. Of that $8 million, somewhere around $700,000 to $900,000 came from retail. All the rest was wholesale. They started to cut wholesale departments and then slash them, and then it was just a bloodbath, or at least that's what Fortune magazine called it. By 1936, wholesale was virtually gone. Marshall Field and Company kept some space in this building for a while for its manufacturing divisions. Marshall Field at one point had about 30 different mills making merchandise, including a lot of textiles, sheets, and towels that they sold under the brand name Fieldcrest, and later was sold to become Fieldcrest Cannon. Finally, in 1945, they sold the Merchandise Mart to a Boston financier named Joseph Kennedy. I think his sons did, something in politics, I've heard. I believe he spent about $13 million for the Merchandise Mart. It had cost Marshall Field and Company somewhere in the range of $25 to $30 million to build this building. Well, with the end of wholesale, the company's attention really turns to building and maintaining its reputation as the premier department store in the Midwest. And it's becoming famous for legends, of which my favorite might be the Frango Mint. Frango Mints, this is the earliest advertisement I have ever found for Frango Mints in Chicago. This is 1947. I don't know if you can see the price, but it is $1.50 a pound. It's a little bit more than that today. The term Frango does not come from Marshall Field and Company. It comes from Seattle's great Frederick and Nelson department stores. If you've ever been to Seattle, it's one of the great names. When Frederick of Frederick and Nelson decided to retire, he wanted to sell the business to Marshall Field and Company. So they bought it in 1929 and got the rights to the name Frango. But when you look at the earliest uses of it at Marshall Fields, you see it on menus as Fields Maple Frango Dessert. It was apparently a sort of frozen custard-like dessert, maple flavored. It wasn't until the 40s, after the war, that they started using it for this little chocolate mint candy, and then it just took off. Frango Mints to this day are associated with Chicago and with Seattle because they were so exclusive. Chicago was the candy capital of America, but the candy that more tourists probably took home than any other was Frango Mints because they were so hard to get anywhere else in the country. Maybe a little bit more exclusive, though, was the 28 shop. For speaking of fashion, became the fashion center of Chicago. This was the store's exclusive boutique for designer originals. It opened in 1941 to be the place for haute couture. And the name 28 Shop came from the address. You got in, you didn't just walk in. You went to a separate entrance at 28 Washington and then took an elevator up to the 6th floor. This is where you would get designer originals. And Marshall Fields had buyers in Paris and Rome and London and Tokyo. If Balenciaga introduced a new woman's suit on the Paris runways, you could get it at the 28 Shop within about 10 days or so. And they liked exclusive deals. In the 1950s, if you wanted a Christian Dior original, the only place to buy it in the city of Chicago was at the 28 Shop at Marshall Fields. But, of course, the benefit of the 28 Shop wasn't just its own income. It gave the whole store this aura of being the height of fashionability. And within the store, there were all kinds of different shops that you could shop for. If you were younger, the sort of teen market, there was the Young Chicago shop. There was the Sunningdale shop, which sold sportswear. There was a shop called the Tip-to-Toe shop, where you could explain what you wanted and they put together a whole outfit for you. There was a famous story of a woman, I think it was in Colorado. I could be wrong, but in any case, her husband was running for governor, and she said, if he wins, I have no idea what to wear. So she went to Marshall Field and Company and told them what her budget would be, and when her husband was elected governor, they put together an entire wardrobe for her, day dresses and hats and shoes and evening gowns and everything. And then they sent invitation to the executives, invitation to the inauguration. If you were a child, not only could you get fashions, but you could also get your own paper dolls. This is a woman I met who was kind enough to share an image. She went to Fields as a little girl, and they took a photograph of her and made it into a paper doll, and then made for her these paper doll costumes so she could dress her own doll. What I love about this is it's a really good example of how you could go to Marshall Fields and get unique things. If you were a wealthy socialite, you could get a Christian Dior gown. If you were a kid, you could get your own custom paper doll. That's the kind of thing that made people adore Marshall Fields. The Marshall Fields elevator girls were very famous. This is a photograph from Life magazine. Do you remember elevator operators? And they would call out the floors, 4th floor, toy department, things like that. They had a whole charm and beauty school to teach them how to do their hair and their makeup, how to call out the floors decorously, things like that. Anyone know the name of the most famous Marshall Fields elevator girl?
Dorothy Lamour.
You got it. Dorothy Lamour, the sarong girl. Dorothy Lamour became a movie star, especially known for wearing sarong. She was in the movies with Bob Hope and Bing Crosby very often. Before she was famous as a movie star, she made $17 a week as a Marshall Fields elevator girl. Other famous Marshall Fields employees, other than those of us in this room, included a young woman named Nancy Davis, who was a shoe clerk. She later married and became Nancy Reagan. Vincent Minnelli worked as a window display designer before he became a film director. And a guy by the name of Montgomery Ward was a traveling salesman for Field and Leiter before he launched the great Montgomery Ward catalog. But of all the times of year, the most famous time of year at Marshall Field and Company was Christmas. The store prided itself on having the world's tallest indoor tree. This is a tree from the 1930s in the Walnut Room. At this point, they said they needed 200 boxes of tinsel icicles to cover that tree. Do you remember the icicles where you had to put them on one at a time? Can you imagine doing that on a tree that is about 48, 49 feet tall? That's how tall that was. And it was a live tree until the early 60s. They would send Marshall Field's employees up north to find a perfectly symmetrical evergreen, chop it down and ship it to Chicago. And by the way, it took about 2 hours just to heave that thing into position on top of the drained fountain there. Once the tree was in position, a team of 3 firefighters took turns guarding the tree 24 hours a day because, you know, fire and Marshall Fields do not go very well together. As I mentioned, in the 60s, they switched to an artificial tree, but I remember hearing from someone who worked there that they had customers who would come and say, "We love coming here for that smell of balsam in the air." It's just so wonderful. The thing that really I love about these trees is that the decorations were made in-house, and it was a labor of love. Every year's decorations were different, and what you might not notice is they even took the trouble to use different sizes. The ornaments up at the top were the smallest, medium-sized ornaments in the middle, and the largest of the ornaments on the lower branches to make this tall tree seem even bigger and grander than it actually was. I talked to someone, a woman who was in her 80s when I talked with her, and she said, "My sisters and I started going to eat in the Walnut Room at Christmas when we were kids. Sometimes we had to get up at 5 a.m. and take 2 buses and a train to get there. But we had it timed. When we got to the store, we'd go to the elevators and then make sure we were the last ones in the elevator. So we would be the first ones out of the elevator so we could get the best spot in line. Because for a long time, if you remember, you had to wait in line with lots of other people also wanting to eat there." All right. And on top of the tree was usually Uncle Mistletoe. If you don't know Uncle Mistletoe, he was Marshall Field's own Christmas mascot. He was introduced in 1948. Joanna Osborne, who worked in the window display department, was given the job, come up with, our own mascot. A lot of stores had their own Christmas mascot. One of the earliest came from Montgomery Ward and Company. They were the original home of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Weebles had the Cinnamon Bear and the Cinnamon Bear radio show. Marshall Fields wanted their own mascot. So in 1948, they introduced this jolly uncle figure. Joanna Osborne had a Norwegian uncle who she said inspired her. He always has on a big red overcoat and a top hat with a sprig of mistletoe. And I don't know if you can see it on this cover, he's got wings. Uncle Mistletoe can fly because his job is to fly around the world and look for children who remember to take time to be kind at Christmas. He's sort of he reports back to Santa if you're being good. He first appeared in the Christmas windows, and the story that year told about Uncle Mistletoe taking some children up to the North Pole to meet Santa Claus. It was so popular that they started using him every year in the Christmas window displays and very quickly became a sort of merchandise bonanza. Uncle Mistletoe dolls today are wildly collectible. The store had a club, the Uncle Mistletoe Kindness Club. If you wrote the store a letter and you described one act of kindness that you did, they would send you a button and membership in the club. He had his own little golden book, one of the few times the character went national. They hired actors to play Uncle Mistletoe and his wife, Aunt Holly. And they had candles and barware and coloring books and Christmas tree ornaments and Uncle Mistletoe ceramic cookie jars today. They appear almost every Christmas on eBay. I saw one last year. They were asking $1,100 for it. So if you have one, don't drop it. They're very collectible. One of the reasons Uncle Mistletoe became so popular is that he starred in his own television show. It was a puppet show. Uncle Mistletoe was voiced by the great character actor Johnny Coons. This first debuted in the late 40s, which is as early as it gets in Chicago children's television. For many years, any kid with a TV was watching Uncle Mistletoe. And some kids were more excited to meet him than to meet Santa when they came to Marshall Fields at Christmas time. Eventually, his popularity waned. They introduced other characters. We mentioned Freddie Fieldmouse earlier. He debuted in the mid-'70s. And by the late turn of the millennium, they had moved on and were doing more fairy tales and traditional Christmas stories and things like that. The store was so big by the mid-20th century that the delivery department was regularly handling around 90,000 packages a day. It had a national reputation because it advertised in magazines like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. It was widely seen as competing with Wanamaker's in Philadelphia for the title of the America's most prestigious full-line department stores. Stores like Saks Fifth Avenue were very prestigious, but they weren't full-line. Marshall Fields was a full-line department store. Shoppers would come to Chicago from all over the Midwest to spend the day shopping. And if you went to Marshall Fields, you often got dressed up, especially if you were going to eat in the Walnut Room. It was an occasion. You know, I love this picture because the girls have curled hair. This little boy, I think, is wearing a suit and those hats, things like that. Marshall Fields had tea in the afternoons, often with a fashion show thrown in. There were great legends. Marshall Fields could do anything. There was a man who, his friend moved across the country and didn't leave the new address. So this man called Marshall Fields and said, "Do you think you could find out my friend's new address?" And they did. I mean, this has nothing to do with retail. But more commonly, if you were having a dinner party and you couldn't remember which side of the plate the fork went on, you could just call Marshall Fields. A lot of teachers would cash their checks at Marshall Fields every week because they offered cash checking on the spot. And of course, if you wanted to shop while you were there, they didn't mind it at all. Certain departments were very famous, especially the toy department. Marshall Fields prided itself on having the most unusual and largest selection of toys in the country. At one point in the 50s, they sold more toys than any other store in the country. You could buy anything from a balloon to a custom-made bicycle at the toy department. Well into the 70s and 80s, there were some people who felt if you needed toys, it was worth a special trip to Marshall Fields on State Street. The book department was also renowned, packed with not just bestsellers, but first editions and antique books. Marshall Fields pioneered a couple of things, and one of them was the author book signing. They were the first store to invite authors in, so you could go and have your book signed by Carl Sandburg or Aldous Huxley or Amelia Earhart, all kinds of authors. There's a famous story that one time they had a children's book about elephants. So they got an elephant from the Lincoln Park Zoo in and trained the elephant to use a rubber stamp to stamp the books. This does appear to be true, as is the story that when the event was over, this elephant refused to get back on the freight elevator. Marshall Fields carpenters apparently had to come in and build a special ramp to get the elephant out. In any case, shoppers' habits were changing. To stay the leading department store, Marshall Fields has got to start opening up branches in the new retail environment, shopping malls. This is groundbreaking for the first, not the first shopping center in the Chicago area, but the first fully conceptualized shopping mall, which was Park Forest Plaza. groundbreaking for Park Florist Plaza was in 1949. In this image, this is Philip Klutznick, one of the great Chicago shopping mall developers. But over here, that's James Palmer, who was then president of Marshall Field and Company. And this guy is Houston McBain, chairman of the board. They were there because Marshall Field and Company actually helped develop Park Forest Plaza, in addition to having an anchor store there. Marshall Fields didn't develop every mall that it was in, but they did develop a number of significant malls in the shopping area, including this one. Does this look familiar to anyone? This is the Marshall Fields store at Old Orchard in Skokie. It looks like they're having a fantastic vintage car show that day, but they weren't. This was soon after it opened. This store opened in 1956, right? Very similarly, this is Oakbrook Center, which opened in 1961, and Woodfield Mall, which opened in 1971. I give you this to give you a little more cocktail party trivia. Woodfield Mall got its name from the Sears board chairman, Robert E. Wood, and the Marshall Fields great visionary, Marshall Field. So if you take Wood and Field, you get Woodfield. So that name lives on, even though the building you see here has been a Macy's for quite a while. This was really the trend. In the 60s and the 70s and beyond, a lot of the company's attention is focused on these shopping mall branch stores. The challenge was, as its focus is shifting to the malls, company's starting to lose some of its distinctiveness that had come when most sales were at the State Street store. Not to mention, competitors are moving in. If you lived in this area in the 70s and beyond, you might remember when Lord & Taylor first opened in the Chicago area, and Bonwit Teller, and Neiman Marcus. These are all department stores that are competing for the same target customer that Marshall Fields had dominated for so many years. But Marshall Fields did have one big supporter. In 1982, this is what the main floor of the State Street looked like. It's kind of a mishmash. They've got the beautiful columns are still there, but now they've kind of slapped on track lighting, and they've taken out those beautiful wooden cases, and the cases are these glass and chrome things. But in 1982, the British tobacco conglomerate Battis Industries purchased Marshall Fields for $360 million. In the Battis era, the State Street store underwent a massive renovation, $115 million renovation. This is what the main floor looked like after the renovation. They put in beautiful recessed lighting, and they gilded the tops of those columns so they don't compete anymore. They brought in much more wood, hearkening back to the original look. The major objective was to unify all the buildings around a central backlit atrium. Here's that atrium with a beautiful escalator system. They found plans for a fountain. This fountain had never been built. It had been designed in 1907, so they built it and installed it. They also reorganized a lot of merchandise floors, moved many departments around, and gave them complete overhauls. It was beautiful. But the company kept facing more and more pressures. In the early 80s, the Store for Men departments were moved back into the main floor. The branch stores this is the Oak Park store, this one and the one in Evanston closed after the 1986 holiday season. Increasingly, the store had to rely on sales just to bring customers into the store. The biggest sale of every year was always the Field Days sale. This was the time when they really started to use the color green. The color green had been used in Marshall Field's bags and boxes as early as the 1870s. But now they introduced this, actually it was beautiful, this barcode in different shades of green, starting to associate the store even more with the color green. But like a lot of department stores, it started to feel at Marshall Fields like it did at most department stores. The same brands, the same kinds of merchandise. And to a lot of Chicagoans, the biggest change had already happened. The Battis acquisition in 1982 marked the end of Marshall Fields as an independent Chicago-based company. Battis sold Marshall Fields to Dayton Hudson. Dayton Hudson later renamed itself Target. That happened in 1990. In 2004, the May department stores acquired Marshall Fields. And finally, in 2005, Federated Department Stores, now known as Macy's, acquired all the May companies. And it was in September of 2006, close your eyes if you're very sensitive, all Marshall Fields stores were renamed and rebranded as Macy's. I find it fascinating that most of the things that we mentioned when I first started are still there. Certainly the building is still there. It's now known as Macy's on State Street. That building is a National Historic Landmark. It is also a Chicago City landmark, which is why those bronze plaques that say Marshall Field and Company are there. They're part of the Chicago City landmark status. If you go down there at Christmas time, they do still have animated windows. They're not nearly as exciting as they used to be. I think last year they had like 4 or 5 animated windows, which is nothing like it was. But when you think about it, at one point there were 7 department stores on State Street. Of those 7 department stores, only one building that had a Chicago department store is still operating as a department store, and that's Macy's on State Street. It's the only one that still has any animated Christmas windows. The Walnut Room is still there. You can still go there any time of year, but especially at Christmas time, it is packed. You can no longer go up to the 8th floor and look down on it. Macy's has sold off space on the upper floors. At Christmas time, they still have a tree. It's a very corporate decorated tree. I think it has none of the charm of the original in-store decorated trees, but it's still there, and you can still go there at Christmas time. You can still buy Frango mints. I mentioned they're not $1.50. I took this photo a couple years ago when they were on sale for $16 a pound. By the way, if you ever feel guilty going into Macy's, I'm not going to. I don't want to be an apologist for Macy's, but I will say Macy's sold off the Frango brand in 2017. The Frango brand is now owned by Garrett's Popcorn, which is another long-standing Chicago company. So you don't need to feel guilty if you were doing it. I talk to people and they say, I never set foot in Macy's unless I need to buy Frango mints, and then it's okay. You can still get Mrs. Herring's chicken pot pie. It is still on the menu to this day, which I find just wonderful and charming. They will even make a Field special sandwich for you if you ask them to. Even the great clocks are still there and still operating. So going back to my original question, if all these things we associate with Marshall Fields are still there, why do Chicagoans feel so strongly about it? Well, of course, it's about a lot more than just Frango mints and beautiful clocks. Part of the emotional reaction has to do with how deep so many people's nostalgia is about this store. So many people had their first job working at Marshall Fields, or had their wedding registry at Fields, or remember going down to Fields with their mother or their aunt or your grandmother, back to school shopping at Fields. And the way that you felt in that store, they treated everyone as special. Well, not everyone in the early days. In the early days, African Americans were always encouraged to go to the budget floor, and even well into the 20th century, there was a tendency to overlook shoppers. But even more than that, I think there's a real civic pride. As early as the 1800s, if you went abroad in the 1880s and said you're from Chicago, they would know that city for a couple of things, probably the stockyards and probably Marshall Fields. Marshall Fields became as much a symbol of Chicago as the Art Institute or Wrigley Field. You know, when we talk about the things we love about Chicago, the things that Chicagoans take pride in, people don't say, you know, oh, we've got this great zoning code. You know, we talk about, which we, maybe is true, but people tend to talk about, you know, we have this amazing art collection at the Art Institute and this fantastic architecture, and we've got Marshall Field and Company. When you think about Chicago evolving from a frontier town with wooden buildings and mud streets into one of the great world metropolises, one of the reasons you can point to the importance of Chicago is that it's the home of one of the great centers for retail and fashion and commerce. I think that's the thread back to 1852 that was cut for a lot of Chicagoans when the change happened. All right, I know I've talked too long, so let me finish up there other than to say thank you all so much for coming. Thanks. Thanks. Okay. All right. I know we've been sitting a long time, but if anyone has questions or something I didn't touch on that's worth sharing. How many people still say Fields when you refer to that building, right? Same way we say the Sears Tower to this day, things like that. I mean, isn't that an indicator of the significance this store has? It really does. Yeah.
One quick cocktail comment. 1893 and 1907 were years of bank panics and real depressions.
You're right.
It must have been a hard time.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
I'm just curious. When did Fields begin hiring women as salespersons, and how important was that in breaking down the patriarchy?
Oh, it's a great question.
The retail sector.
It's a great question. The question is about when did Fields start hiring women especially as sales clerks. It was actually very early, and it seems to, I don't have a specific date, but it seems to have been an innovation of Marshall Field. Most store clerks in the mid-19th century were men, and they were expected to know the merchandise well and to sell it, literally, do the selling work. Marshall Field started bringing in female sales clerks partly to make it more comfortable for women shoppers, especially in departments like lingerie, which was, a little awkward. You don't want to be buying a new corset from some guy. And it did. I mean, it was part of making the experience pleasurable and not at all awkward. But it very much accelerated in the late 19th into the early 20th century. There were a lot of female sales clerks for a couple of reasons. The more technology entered it, especially with the arrival of cash registers in the early 20th century, sales clerking became, I'm going to jabber away because I find this question fascinating. Let me shorten it. It became less skilled, so they could hire for less skilled workers. And that's when they really started hiring a lot of women. And it was a really desirable job for a lot of working class women because the other options were less appealing. You could be a domestic servant, in which case you have very little free time on your own, or you can work in a department store and you've got your free time and you're surrounded by all this elegance. It was a very desirable position. Marshall Field and Company was not exclusively female clerks, but there was a large percentage of them, especially in certain departments like women's wear and millinery and lingerie and things like that.
About women, the women were not allowed to wear pants.
You're right. Yes. Yes, her mother worked, and she's pointing out women were not allowed to wear pants. That is so true. There was a real emphasis on character, and it's interesting if you look at Marshall Field's employee codes of conduct. In the 1920s, female clerks at Marshall Fields were not allowed to bob their hair. They had to have conservative haircuts. You had to put it in a net if you did that. And that kind of continued through the years. I remember when I worked at Marshall, here I'll date myself. I was at Marshall Fields in 1991, and there was this brief phase where women were wearing suits with shorts. And you'd have like opaque tights on them. And one of my coworkers wore one of these. I mean, it's opaque tights and it was long shorts. She looked kind of chic, but she was sent home because you did not wear that. And that was 1992, 91, something like that. It's a very conservative place that way. Yeah. I didn't say anything about the China department. It was wonderful, wasn't it? Yes. And you could get replacements of almost any China piece. If you broke something, you could go to Marshall Fields and they could find a replacement. Yeah. Did you get your China at Fields?
Well, I didn't get my China. I had it picked out, but I used to have people come and select a China, and I'd be like, "Now, what do you think of scrambled egg?"
I love it. She's talking about visualizing the food on a particular China pattern. It's true. And the China department was right off of the entry from the L to get into Marshall Fields, which I always thought was the weirdest thing. You know, you got all your bags and things and your and coats. Yeah.
I'm a friend with China department.
Oh, really? Yeah.
I worked in budget lingerie.
You did. She worked in budget lingerie.
Does anybody remember box sets?
No. Does anyone remember box-its? Do you?
Order ahead of time. Oh my God, there was tricot nylon gowns.
Wow.
They have
Oh my gosh.
extra large, triple X.
Oh, that's funny.
So I was in that department where women worked.
Yes, yes.
It was in the downstairs of Fuller.
What a
In
hoot.
1970.
Wow, that's not that long ago. You're reminding me of a fun piece of trivia that's related to lingerie. Jockeys, you know, jockey shorts, which I think just turned 100, they were first introduced at Marshall Field and Company, of all places. As was, I do not know why this is sticking in my head, but there was this farmer who developed this popcorn that was like really big kernels. When he debuted on the market, he got the gourmet food department to carry his popcorn. It was Orville Redenbacher, first debuted at Marshall Field and Company. I love this kind of trivia. So, yeah.
I was going to say, I was the lingerie buyer in 58.
You were. She was the lingerie buyer in 1958. Oh, my goodness. Wow. Do you still have any? I'm just kidding. Don't answer
My
that.
children were embarrassed. They'd say,
Were they?
"It's for Marshall Field," and she's a lingerie buyer.
Oh, my goodness. That's funny. That's funny. Do you remember what floor lingerie was on? Third floor. Okay, there you go. I love it. I love it. Yeah, in the back.
When I was looking for a job for after school while I was
Yeah.
in school, I lived on the North Shore, and Marshall Field paid 10 cents an hour more than any of the other.
Really?
But you had to be 17 to
Oh, my goodness. So you went to Carson's instead. Oh, my goodness. You know, that's interesting because there have been there was not full research done, but a few isolated moments where you see what Marshall Fields was paying. And typically the pay, not typically, but often the pay was not any better than any other store. But it was desirable because it's Marshall Fields. So that's nice that they did that. I mean, 10 cents an hour, you know, that can add up quick. Yeah.
My mother was a buyer from Marshall Fields. She actually bought for the Sunningdale shop.
Oh, she did. She bought for the Sunningdale shop. How fun. Wow.
Better dresses, and even had a stint in wedding.
Oh, wow. That's
She
exciting.
mentioned besides the dress code too, you couldn't wear flats.
Ah, yes. That's true. That's true. In addition to not being able to wear to not being able to wear pants, female associates had to wear heels. And you know, I have heard that's true even for the window display designers. If you were like, you know, in the windows, you had to still wear that. I just can't believe it. I wonder if your mother and
Is it Beverly? Was your mother Beverly?
No, her name was Penelope.
Penelope. Fanny.
oh, that's funny. How funny. And you know, you might have been there. No, you're too young. My grandfather started as a sales associate in 1934, and he became the buyer for the linen department. He was there in the 40s and the 50s. And then he actually, no, it was Goddard. It was Goddard. He was sent to be the buyer in Tokyo for a couple years. So my grandfather lived in Tokyo buying for Marshall Fields. I mean, how fun is that? Yeah.
I was at Fields forever and ever and ever.
Were you?
I worked in the fashion office. I was the
fun.
fashion director for the men's and children's.
Wow.
And then I also worked in the women's fashion office.
Oh, what
I don't know if
fun.
anyone remembers, but they had those huge fashion shows, like
Yes.
designer shows twice a year.
Yes.
And I was in the fashion office. We had New York designers like Calvin Klein, Bill Bloss,
Yes.
Jeffrey Bean, and then one year we had Givenchy come.
Oh, my
And
goodness.
the finale for the show was about 5 or 6 couture gowns that he brought with him.
Wow. Oh, what a thrill. She's talking about the fashion shows that Fields had, and especially the events when the big designers came. I did not know that Givenchy had come.
Designer shows
Yeah.
lasted about 2 hours.
Yeah.
30 models.
Can believe it. I mean, can you imagine? What a thrill.
Jean Lacasse. Oh, yes.
We should have a reunion here, right? Bring everyone together. So let's take one more. Yeah.
One other thing, if you worked at Fields, you got discount after you left.
Yes.
However,
If you worked at Fields, you often got a discount after you left.
if you worked for departments, like the cosmetic departments, where you worked for the cosmetic company.
Yes.
They did not give it to you.
That's right. The cosmetics clerks were their whole separate thing. Very true. Very true. Let me leave you with one funny story. I was talking to someone who had worked at Fields, and he said on his first day, he was told Marshall Fields takes things back. He worked in the candle department. And on one of, his first week, someone came in to return candles, and they were used. And you can't hide when a candle has been used. So he went to his manager and said, what do I do? And his boss said, you take them back. Marshall Fields will take anything back. And when you think about it, all of these things, the exclusive designer fashions, the experience of going in there, the returns policy, it's all what builds incredible customer loyalty. It's the reason that people would talk about Fields and say, Marshall Fields is my store, like we own it, because of the way you felt and the way you were treated. It was all part of an experience. And boy, don't we miss it today. So thank you all so much for coming. Thanks.